Okay, the last presentation this morning is entitled Challenges with Establishing and Maintaining Effective Seed Systems, a Global Perspective, presented by Jamie Rhoads. And Jamie is the Assistant Director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Peanuts. He's got extensive experience around the world. He spent a lot of time in Haiti working as a agricultural program director for Meds and Foods for Kids. So Jamie, join us up here.
Well, thanks, David, for inviting me for the talk. I accepted this with a lot of humility and a bit of imposter syndrome because I started thinking about the first time I came to the APRES conference, which was maybe 12 years ago, and I thought, I didn't understand half of the presentations that were going on. So the idea of me coming up to the seminar at the beginning was a little intimidating, but I hope I can contribute a little bit. So yeah, I am Jamie Rhoads. I am the Assistant Director of the Peanut Innovation Lab at the University of Georgia. I'm based in Athens. First thing, I wanted to kick off just explaining what that is. What is the Peanut Innovation Lab? We are part of the U.S. government's global food security program called Feed the Future. This map is probably not all that useful to look at other than explaining a little bit where we work. Our program current program is a 5-year program. We're working in 4 countries, Senegal, Ghana, Uganda, and Malawi. And then we have a lot of affiliated research in surrounding countries. We have a lot of we're in the final year of our program, current program, and there are a number of our scientists and students who are presenting here at APRES, and that's been a really nice opportunity, I would say, and I appreciate the society welcoming all these international participation because it's a great experience, I think, and we have a number of our colleagues here in person too. And you know, we have 10 U.S. universities, a number of African institutions. We have a big role that we play both in research and capacity development. So we train currently about 70 graduate students. Our portfolio is based around these 4 areas of inquiry: variety development, value-added gains, nutrition, and kind of generalized, I would put it as social science, but around gender and youth. A lot of the themes of the previous speakers kind of resonate in many of the things, including there's an image of the risk index tool. We were working very closely with David on that project, and I would say it's a nice example of one of our other mandates as the Innovation Lab, is that we have a dual benefit mandate as USAID to benefit the U.S. as well as our overseas partners that are mostly in Africa. So the index tool being a very good example. We've taken, helped make that tool simplified in a way that can be used with Excel, and it's available in several of our countries. And using the same process that was described earlier today for tomato spotted wilt and affiliated diseases, we're starting that process with our collaborating scientists to think about all the variables and how to measure them and move forward with that approach. Another really nice example of that dual benefit approach would be on early detection of diseases. Soraya mentioned GRD, or brown nut rosette disease, is an incredibly devastating insect vectored viral disease, and we've already identified sources of resistance. Now, one of the other projects that we found in our portfolio, that the weeds, the virus, and the vectors are all present here and in many places in the world, and we really don't know why it isn't here, possibly, and why it wouldn't move. And there's a lot of interesting questions about why that might be. But the fact that we're doing that research where it's already a hotspot in Uganda, we can figure out, using our genetic tools, to have those resistances before they come into play potentially in the U.S. So, you know, that's roughly what the Peanut Innovation Lab does. And what I'm really going to talk about, I guess, is the seed systems question. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact that we're emerging from the COVID and now with Russia and Ukraine into probably the biggest food security crisis on a global scale that we've had in a generation. And we here in the US sort of see it in food prices and the restaurant prices when we go out to dinner, but in the rest of the world, in a lot of places we work, it's a little bit scarier than that. So I want to talk about that briefly. I'll talk about kind of some research that I did and presented at APRES last year that probably triggered this talk, thinking about how seed systems work around the world and a little bit of a comparative analysis. And then recognizing that peanut presents a lot of specific challenges to seed systems. And then I want to talk about some of those examples and some of the things that we learned through that research. I spoke to probably 2 or maybe even 3 dozen people at this point from across the globe about how the seed systems work in different places and specific challenges they have. So I'll review those challenges and then talk about maybe some needed research, since we are the Research and Education Society. So first, the global food crisis. You're going to start hearing a lot more about this, and I wanted to speak about it relative to just the specific relevance of peanut. I think we've seen food prices all over the world, particularly vegetable oils and things like that, going up because of the Ukraine issue. The other piece, being fertility. I don't have to sell peanuts to this room, obviously, and also this is the American Peanut Research and Education Society, and I think I would say I'm guessing a little bit that David invites me or Dave to come speak because we want to have a bit of an added global perspective. So I'll try to do that a little bit. The first being that, and Soraya touched on this a little bit, that peanut is the most widely grown legume in the world. Now, obviously that's important because we need nitrogen. It's not all going to come from synthetic sources forever because we have these kind of challenges. But most of the peanut crop in the world, probably 2/3 of it, is grown by smallholder producers with relatively low yields. So when you take in India, China's a little bit different, but 1/3 of the production is in Africa, and basically all of Scott's talk about inputs is, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but almost, because the use of inputs is almost zero. So breeding and genetics, and ultimately, where we go on our seed system is going to be incredibly important. Peanuts, we love our sandy soils in South Georgia and elsewhere in Florida, et cetera, but peanuts grow in relatively bad soils. That's one of the reasons that they do that. Across from Senegal to Sudan, across the Sahel, the reason that peanut is grown there is because it's kind of the only thing that grows and that you can make money on. Peanut is drought and heat tolerant, and as we have an emerging global climate crisis with 112-degree heat index out there, for example, peanut is one of those crops that seems to hang in there pretty well relative to many of the other crops. The diversity of uses, what I mean to say by that is that, I think here in the US, in Victor's talk, it made me think about, thinking about alternative uses, and the rest of the world, peanut butter is an emerging demanded commodity, but peanut is used in so many different ways that we probably don't take into consideration very well here in the US. Both as a protein source and livestock feed, but obviously oil is probably the major one, but also my colleague from Senegal is here, and he told me that it's roughly about 1/3 of the value of a peanut plant is the fodder in the Sahel. So feeding livestock, and of course with the food security issue, it's fertility. It's having nitrogen available and organic matter turning over. We had a recent publication from the Ag Econ department at UGA basically showing that even when your soils are so degraded in several places in Africa, adding synthetic fertilizer does not give you a yield response. So we need to incorporate more legumes and more long-term fertility strategies. Soraya also made a comment about how most of these people are producing, and yes, a lot of it is at the sort of subsistence farm level, but most of it is really selling into markets. It's regional and local markets. And it's really important to know that peanut is a cash crop that pays for schools and hospitals and all the things that function across these very large populations of people that grow peanut. It's also, just to put it in there, that the fact that we can store it in the shell it's a great savings. It has a pretty nice interest rate if you think about the price at harvest being quite low and the price at planting being quite high. If they can afford to hang on to them, it can usually be a 3x return, which relative to what my retirement has done recently looks pretty good. And then finally, again, I'm not going to sell everybody here on peanuts. I think we're preaching to the choir, but they're delicious and nutritious, and people can grow it in their backyards. We had a mother of a student at a research project in Uganda. I think it was an offhand comment, but she had just kind of learned about all these nutritious benefits of peanuts. And she said, yeah, we grow beans and we know they're good for our kids, but they don't really want to eat them as a snack. But now that I know I can grow peanuts, it sort of encapsulated in my brain, like, yeah, like what other legitimate superfood can you grow in your backyard and feed your family with? So in this emerging global food crisis that we're going to start hearing more about, I think our crop that we all care about plays a very important role, and particularly for some of the most affected people on the planet. So that's my pitch on peanuts to the choir. But so moving on to the seed systems question. Now, I started to work on this a little bit a couple of years ago because I think we understand that seeds are important, but maybe not how important or how seed systems work in the diversity of how they work across the globe. And if you just think of it, I mean, very basically, that all this beautiful research that we do on genomics and the potential that we're unlocking, all the amazing things that we can do on agronomy on the other side, there's an obvious bottleneck of like, where does it come from and how do we get there? And we don't really think about it that much, being how complex the seed systems are. So how do we start to think about like measuring the parameters of success or evaluating a seed system and beyond just describing it, but hopefully moving towards things to improve it? So these are just some ideas that I had talking with people all over the world. You know, quality of seeds is pretty easy to measure. Does it germinate? What's the vigor? Purity is another issue. You know, yeah, it makes sense. What's the foreign matter in a lot, but also like, what's the genetic purity once it gets out there? I think we've seen that even here in the States with hyoleics and some of the challenges around the nematode resistance. And I'll get to it, but we're thinking about, we probably need some additional tools, either genotyping or phenotyping, to how do we evaluate purity once it gets out there. We've got some stories in places where we spend a whole lot of money and effort to get a really nice variety out there. It gets released, and then we're not exactly even sure what the farmers are growing out once it gets to the farm level. Pipeline and replacement. I had a long conversation with Dr. Sham Nigam, who was the head groundnut breeder at APRES just recently in Uganda, and he was kind of delineating this in my mind a little bit about, you know, we have a pipeline of what's all the great varieties that we are bringing into the system in a seed system, but then what's the replacement? And when we think about it in the US, we think about variety replacement, you know, over the generations, how many, but in most of the places we work, it's how often does that farmer actually go to buy certified seed from somewhere that they know what it is, because it's mostly all farmer saved or regionally purchased seeds. So how often can we actually get a new variety into their hands to replace it? So replacing that variety at the farm level. Resilience is probably a little bit trickier to measure. There's been some economists working on this, but thinking about a theme that I've seen throughout all the presentations today is that, you know, genetic diversity offers a lot of resilience, but the system, the seed system itself, can experience some pretty significant shocks, whether it's regional drought. You know, as David said, I worked in Haiti. There was a big earthquake there. It was a big shock to the system, literally. We've had other cases where it's, you know, political things can disrupt the seed systems. The whole presentation this morning, come to think that tomato spotted wilt virus was a pretty big shock to the system in terms of what varieties were going to be available. The last one is kind of also taking from, in my mind, thinking about food security, because when you think about food security, usually they talk about availability and access, meaning, you know, is the food available to you? Can you afford to buy it? How far do you have to go to get it? And seed's really the same thing. Is how much does it cost? How far do you have to go to get a quality certified seed? Is it distributed evenly? Those kinds of things. And I would say, cost-wise, we were talking about this a little bit last night, that, the premium for seed peanut in the US is actually not all that much, because farmers are growing large volumes, and it's just the best growers that are the ones getting it. Whereas in Africa and in Asia, where I don't know the cases as much, it can be 4x the cost to buy certified seed over farmer saved seed, and their only input usually is seed, other than land and labor. So cost is a really big deal in terms of getting good quality genetics out there. So peanuts, what in particular are we concerned about peanut being different as a seed system? And boy, the more I talked about it and the way we think about it in our program about like, how are we going to get these good varieties out there? Man, peanut is a difficult one. So, it's difficult because many reasons, but the fact that seed and grain in most people's minds is not that differentiated. So we can go to a seed producer in most places in Africa, and the production looks more or less the same way that you would grow grain. So that's just a challenge on the economics of it. Among all grain legumes, peanut has the lowest multiplication rate in the world and probably the highest seeding rate in the world. So you combine that, and mathematically, it makes it really challenging to scale up seed and get it out there. Peanut is relatively fragile. It's bulky and unique. And what I mean by unique is that you can't go run your normal combine that you would use for wheat or soybeans or whatever. You have to have all this specialized handling equipment because it's fragile and bulky. And if you break it, it doesn't germinate, the skin slips, etc. So it adds a lot of expense to managing a lot the volumes of seed that are out there. Where we work, mostly across the countries in Africa, there's a very limited market pull because it's fragmented and informal. So meaning that you've got a whole bunch of little small growers, there's not a big aggregators in most cases. And so it makes it very hard to sort of figure out what growers want, and then also to sort of pull the seeds into the market. And then also like who's going to invest in it when it's all this kind of fragmented grower. Variety turnover being low. This is actually a universal thing. I mean, think about it. With the presentations this morning, we had Flow Runner for 30 years before it kind of got knocked off the pedestal. Now we've got changes in there. We've got O6G that's been around for a long time, and that happens everywhere. It's the same in every country that we work, that there's a sort of standard variety, and it's really hard to kind of replace it. You either need a shock to the system like tomato spotted wilt virus, or you need a change that says, oh, we have to have high oleic, or you get some kind of, Dr. Nigam gave the example of saying, if you get a 20% yield increase, so much so that the farmer doesn't need statistics or even to slow down when they're driving by to see it in the field, that's when you release a variety and you get a big impact. So, from everything from the farm level to the seed system to processing, everything kind of gets tuned to a variety. And so it makes it extra hard to kind of push it. What's the catalyst that can push that variety out of the way to the next thing? Seed systems being political is kind of a strange statement, but I was thinking about it in the way that like most seed research in the US would probably be done under, say, physiology, looking at germination and those kinds of things. But in reality, when I think about it, and maybe this is my training, it's more about sort of economics and political science, because every country context is very different. And in many cases, how the government invests can lead to maybe a really nice result in some cases. In other cases, it can lead to corruption and things that make it very challenging to push varieties out there. And so adding all these things up, it makes it a really difficult business case. So what I've basically found is that unless you're in the peanut business in terms of a processor, no seed company in their right mind is really that interested in investing in just peanut seed. And that's kind of just an African experience, but it seems to be fairly universal. So I tried to think about this, and There will be a quiz later for the people who can identify all these maps or flags from Africa, but seed systems kind of fit on this axis. It's not in any way empirical or quantitative. It's just totally my impressions of things and how I wanted to present some of these cases, but along the sort of formal to informal and private to public, and I'd be happy to discuss this later in debate with people. But if we kind of go one by one, like Argentina in the top right here, it's mostly vertically integrated. It's mostly private. It's all in kind of the formal sector. The US, we have a bit more public engagement with lots of public breeders and the university system being engaged in the seeds, and even, you know, in the Georgia case, the Georgia seed development and that having a very clear public-private partnership. I threw in India just specifically because of talking with Dr. Nigam about how there's an early seed generation push that comes from the public sector, but then it kind of morphs into the semi-formal where there's what they call truthfully labeled seed. It's not truly certified because the cost of certification is challenging. And then kind of down in the right, so Malawi, I don't know if Malawi's this black and red and green one, is a really interesting case because there's a lot of emerging sort of larger scale private investment, and they have taken over the early seed generation. It's been an absolute game changer in terms of getting varieties that have been sitting quite literally on a shelf sometimes and pulling them out and getting them available to farmers at large scale. So, you know, what can we do to mirror that a little bit? Senegal, and my colleague Issa is here, and I spoke with him for a long time and thinking about the public sector plays a very big role in scaling seed, but the limited funding of the public sector in many African countries makes scaling very difficult, and the limited aggregation for a lot of private players makes it challenging. And the two in the bottom being Uganda and Ghana, where the markets are almost entirely informal, and the breeding systems are at the public level with very low funding. It makes it so there's just a huge challenge of producing, say, early generation seed and getting it out there when there's you know, the level of certification and so forth is very small. All that to say that context, wherever our lab is working and trying to think about the things that are important that we need to work on, is very important. The critical one that we keep seeing over and over again is how do we manage early generation seed? You know, we have a really nice system here. I know the Georgia system better than others, but where the Georgia seed development and the foundation seed producers do an excellent job. They're sort of known for getting very high quality germination and managing it well. And it has this nice public-private partnership. The rest of the world, usually it's like relying on one guy who's the peanut breeder, and they have limited funds, and they are growing in a system with almost no mechanization or inputs. So that multiplication challenge comes back again because they're growing, say, 1 ton yields to produce, you know, breeder seed. Regulations are variable in all these different contexts. I just, you know, I had one example that I wanted to share of, like, in Malawi, they have a seed law that says that every seed class, kind of based on the OECD, that, you know, every seed class has to go one to the next, meaning you have to take breeder seed to then make your foundation seed to then go to, et cetera. But with the low multiplication rates of peanuts, you almost can't do that by the nature of it at large scale. You have to use foundation to foundation, which is illegal under their system. So we've been working with them a little bit to recognize that, and probably need some policy research to reinforce how that could work. And I think that happens in many other countries where the policy regulations are built more around hybrid maize or hybrid corn systems that are just so very different. Accountability. You know, if you're totally reliant on the Ministry of Agriculture Seed Services Unit, for example, that has, say, like 1 pickup truck for a country and maybe 2 seed inspectors, how in the world do you expect them to actually go out to the thousands of seed producers to certify them? It's impossible. And the cost of doing it per unit shouldn't be burdened by the smallholder farmer either. So we need to think about, like, how do we manage accountability within those systems in a different way? Market formalization, fragmentation, I've kind of spoken around that theme quite a bit, but it just presents a big challenge. In the case of like Malawi, I was giving an example where large private sector companies producing commercial seed, they've basically just changed the whole environment in one country within 3 years. Seed purity, I mentioned earlier, and I think this is a challenge maybe for us to think about how further down the line. I know there's some emerging technologies like the Q sorter for high oleic seeds, and there's genomic tools that we can use for testing purity at lots, but it gets complicated when it gets away from the breeder seed. And if the system doesn't work, we had one example of this in Malawi, where we've spent a lot of time to get groundnut rosette resistant varieties out there. The incidence of GRD is fairly irregular, kind of like tomato spotted wilt virus. So we got this variety out there, and the farmer said, "Oh, we're growing this variety," and then the GRD incidence was really high, and it was like, "Well, why isn't it resistant?" And then we kind of said, "Well, certified seed, but we don't really even know what it is." So we have to go in and use some new thinking to get those tools available to figure out what we're growing and how to maintain it. And I think in sustainability in general, we have this challenge in the food crisis that we're seeing of balancing out resilience versus efficiency. I mean, the example that we've heard about, like meat packers, there's like, what, 4 giant meat packers that cover like 40% of all beef processing in the US. That seems pretty efficient, no doubt, to get low-cost beef, but it's also susceptible to big shocks. Or maybe the baby formula is the other one that's a good example. And seed is the same. I think we've seen a lot of nice talks about genetic diversity and what offers, but on the other side of that, if you talk to a foundation seed producer, they're not going to be real happy with you if you're expected to produce 10 or 15 different varieties at a large level, because just the cost of, say, like cleaning out the sheller between seed varieties makes it inefficient. So they're quite happy that maybe it's 80% Georgia 06G for a while. And I think we have to figure out how to balance those out. So I'll try to wrap up quickly too. Research areas, again, the early generation seed, I think we've got to look at that Malawi case closer, and how do we scale it? Modernizing seed certification systems. There's probably some emerging ICT ways of doing that at lower costs to reduce the cost of certification. I know they're doing that here with QR codes and things like that, and there's technologies to do that in Africa. We have a case of what we call quality declared seed. This is a system that's been promoted in a few places, but it's like the India case I was mentioning, where it's not fully burdening the cost of certification for smallholders, but it's basically like sort of forming small co-ops. They were calling them in Uganda these local seed businesses that are recognized seedsmen. Seems pretty intuitive, but it's also difficult to get the finances right, marketing, how are they doing storage? But it gives us an example of a way in a relatively informal, low-cost system to start pushing out good varieties. I already talked a bit about the purity assessments and things. And when I was reviewing this, I remembered that, seed treatment, we saw Scott's example about the loss of dynasty. Seed treatment is not used in almost anywhere at any large scale on peanuts. In low input settings, but I think it could be the one pretty applicable technology. And I know, for example, like with the polymer technologies and using biologicals and getting lots of active ingredients on a seed, it might be something that could help differentiate, say, an actual certified seed from just farmer safe seed and make a business case for somebody. So that's an area of research that I think would be interesting. And then on the economic side of things, I mentioned just the issues of like corruption that can happen in some places, but we've seen where there's a mandate of using certified seed, but without the other measures that are in there for accountability, there's a lot of risk with those systems not working. So there's research on that. Where do we put our dollars, both as the public sector in an African country where there's not a lot of resources, but also as USAID? How do we invest our money as a donor to be the most effective to get these investments that we've already made in genetics out to have impact? And so with that, I'm going to finish. And if there's anyone that has questions, I'm available now or at lunchtime. I know I'm the last speaker before lunch as well, so thanks.
We'll get one question before you head out the door. Maybe, or not. Oh, there's one.
It's obvious the economic benefit of the growers if they could improve the seed. But is there anybody who else, a middleman or anybody who could economically benefit by facilitating this happens? Because it seems to me there's so many fragmented growers, small growers, there's the political side, that is there any business model where there's so many benefits in between to make it happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a good question. I think, the economic benefits for smallholders actually is just to do a really good job saving their own seed, but that limits our ability to get new varieties out there for sure. In fact, in most countries, we see, because the certified system doesn't work very well, that farmer saved or locally managed seed gets better germination rates. So getting somebody that really knows how to grow seeds, really, like the case here, it's like who's the seed, where do you get your seed from? It's the sheller. And I think that's the case where we need in emerging markets, is to say, like, if the shellers are invested in seed, or if they want to get into the business of peanuts, they're going to have to get into the business of seed. And I think that's the case that we saw in Malawi, and we probably will be in other places as well. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Don't forget, things start back up at 1:30. So thanks for sticking with us this morning, and we'll see you in the afternoon.